Hi, it's Dwyer. GamblersAdvisory.com, DwyerVIP.com. Here with some thoughts on the rematch of the Bernard Hopkins versus Chad Dawson fight for supremacy in the light heavyweight division. But before I continue, just remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. It's April the 15th. First, some housekeeping about last night's fights. It's a big week for Dwyer VIP subscribers. The over delivered in the one Manuel Marquez versus Sergei Fedchenko fight, as that fight went the distance. Brandon Rios, and I understand this is controversial, Brandon Rios delivered, as he was awarded the win over Richard Abril. Mike Alvarado delivered, as he beat Mauricio Herrera in a shootout. Couple that with the two successful tennis plays involving Jankovic and Isner, and VIP subscribers were up big this weekend. There will be bad weekends. There will be losses in gambling. But this weekend, even with the bad free pick in the Casitas fight, delivered. Now let's talk about Hopkins versus Dawson. Let me say this. I have a video up already for the first fight, in which I picked Chad Dawson to win that fight. For those who don't know, that fight was eventually declared a no contest after Dawson was initially awarded the win when Hopkins could not continue after falling on his shoulder. Right? I have a video of that infamous second round, and I encourage everyone to look at it, because a lot of what I say is going to be based on video from the actual fight. I have a video from that second round. It's a Canadian broadcast because of copyright issues, and it's on my channel page right now. Now let's talk about styles and issues, right? I like Dawson in the rematch, but it's complicated. I believe Bernard Hopkins has a stylistic problem, not an effectiveness problem. In other words, I'm expecting Hopkins to have moments where he's effective in the ring. But I believe that Dawson is going to look like he is the fighter who has the upper hand. And quite frankly, in boxing, sometimes appearances are everything. The way I'm playing this is I'm taking Chad Dawson to win the fight. If I were to bet heavy money on it, Dawson is the favorite. Gamblers have figured this one out. If I were to bet heavy money on it, right, then I might want to straddle it with Bernard by decision. But I fully expect Chad Dawson to take the light heavyweight championship in this fight. And here is why. Hopkins has already fought a very shrewd southpaw who uses angles and who works behind a jab. That was former light heavyweight champion, current cruiserweight champion, Antonio Tarver. Right now, what's important in that fight is the fight pattern. Right? When Bernard Hopkins fights a southpaw who's advanced, who works behind a jab, right, and who doesn't have the heavy emphasis on hand speed that Joe Calzaghe has. In other words, when Hopkins fights a southpaw who's skilled, like Chad Dawson, Hopkins literally abandons his jab. Right? His jab's out the window. It might surprise some people to know that in his fight against Antonio Tarver, a fight that Hopkins won, he shocked the boxing establishment. Right? In that fight, Hopkins never lands, according to CompuBox, 3 jabs in any round. Right? In fact, quite frankly, looking at the numbers, they're a bit staggering, because you'll actually see that Hopkins, over a fight that went the distance, 12 rounds, Hopkins landed a total of 7 jabs in that fight. Right? By the way, let me say that the punch stat report can be found online for free at boxingscene.com. Right? Well, the point is this, and by the way, hardcore fight fans know that Hopkins hardly threw any jabs against Joe Calzaghe either. Calzaghe, like Tarver, like Dawson, also a southpaw. We now have CompuBox numbers from his fight against Chad Dawson. So we can already see the fight pattern from these two guys actually being in the ring. By the way, these punch stat numbers, punch stat report, can also be found on boxingscene.com, a great site. Now, what you'll see when you look at the CompuBox numbers from these guys, the first fight, is that Bernard Hopkins didn't land a jab in the first round of the fight. In fact, let's get deeper. In the first round of the fight, Bernard Hopkins only threw 2 jabs. In the second round, Bernard Hopkins threw 4 jabs. He landed 1. In other words, the first time these guys met, Hopkins threw a total of 6 jabs and landed 1 over the first 2 rounds. Right? The fight ends toward the end of the second round. Right? By contrast, Chad Dawson, who has a body language problem, think of him as the Eli Manning of boxing, right? Looks like he doesn't care, looks relaxed, people take him for granted, people wonder if he's committed. Meanwhile, the guy's doing great things, right? He's beaten Glenn Johnson, he's beaten Tarver multiple times, he's doing great things, and he's one of the sport's elite talents. On my Dwyer Top 10 Boxing.blogspot.com page, I only have, pound for pound, Floyd Mayweather, Sergio Martinez, and Andre Ward rated ahead of him. And 2 of those 3 are unbeaten. Right? Well, the point is this. When people look at Dawson, he looks like Eli Manning. Right? You think he's just there, even when he's masterful. As laid back as Dawson looks in the ring, he's a very active fighter. In the first round against Hopkins, Dawson threw 16 jabs. He landed 2 of them. In the second round against Hopkins, Dawson threw 14 jabs. He landed 1 of them. Right? Dawson, in the 2 rounds against Bernard Hopkins, pumped out 30 jabs. Understand, like Eli Manning, while it looks like Dawson's just standing around because of body language, Dawson is actually very active. Right? Where this fight gets interesting, and I mean very interesting, is in the power punch numbers. They're startling. If a fighter is able to land more than 40% of their power punches, that fighter's balling. that fighter's being very effective, right? That fighter has a very high accuracy rate, especially when you're talking about elite level competition, right? Two fighters who have had the light heavyweight belt at different times. Well, Bernard Hopkins, here's where his effectiveness comes in. In the first fight against Chad Dawson, in the first round, through 11 power shots, he landed 5 of them. 5. 45% connect rate. In the second round, he threw 12 power shots. And keep in mind, Hopkins throughout his career has been known to be a notoriously slow starter. Right? When you look at Bernard Hopkins early in a fight, you know that the Hopkins you see in the first 2 rounds, just look at his numbers in the Pascal rematch. The Hopkins you see in the first 2 rounds isn't the Bernard Hopkins who's going to be there in the 8th, 9th, 10th rounds. Right? In the second round, Hopkins landed 42% of his power shots. Right? So Bernard Hopkins was over the 40% threshold. By contrast, Dawson in the first round threw 15 power shots. He landed 3 of them, 20%. In the second round, he threw 10 power shots. He landed 1 of them, 10%. So here we get the enigma of this fight. Right? Bernard Hopkins, who arguably got robbed in the rematch against Jermaine Taylor. Right? Bernard Hopkins has a problem. It's a stylistic problem against fighters who can hunt him down with a jab. But particularly against southpaws, I believe the problem is more pronounced. Because Bernard isn't throwing a jab against southpaws who can operate behind one like Dawson, Bernard Hopkins cannot match the volume of his southpaw opponent. So, between these two fighters, Hopkins, in the 2 rounds, threw a total of 29 punches. Chad Dawson threw 55. Right? Because Bernard isn't throwing a jab when they're away from each other, Chad Dawson, even the Chad Dawson with the body language problem, the Eli Manning body language problem, looks like he's the hunter, looks like he's making the fight, looks like he's the much more active fighter. Right? Understand too that Tomas Ademic, right, world-class fighter, I would argue he's a future Hall of Famer, right? Cruiserweight champion, former cruiserweight champion, now campaigning at heavyweight, was dominant at light heavyweight as well. Did you know that the guy who holds the record for the most jabs landed in a round against Tomas Ademic is Chad Dawson? Right? Dawson is active with the jab when he wants to be. So here's how I think this fight unfolds. I think Dawson is just going to look like he's the more active fighter. Hopkins doesn't have great punching power. Right? Hopkins,
a vast virus database has been updated.
Hopkins won't be able to pull the game plan that he pulled against Antonio Tarver. And people need to remember, Tarver had to lose a lot of weight before that fight because Tarver was in a Rocky movie where he was playing a heavyweight champion. So Tarver lost a lot of weight before he fought Hopkins, and by Tarver's own admission, he was dead at the weight on the night of the fight. Right? Now, Tarver, as it is, doesn't have the foot speed, isn't the athlete that Chad Dawson is. So Hopkins, who was able to really fight a bit of an ambush fight against Tarver, likely won't be able to do that against Chad Dawson. Not only that, there's a great moment in the second round. It's a fleeting moment, but it's a revealing moment where Hopkins lunges in. And keep in mind, Hopkins is such a master at clinching that during this fight, in the first round, at one point, Hopkins has Chad Dawson in a headlock. Right? There's a moment in the second round where Hopkins practically tosses Dawson to the canvas. Dawson looks like he's about to go down. Right? Hopkins comes inside, and the clinching is crucial because if Hopkins is not going to throw a jab, he has to find a way to jump inside and not get battered. Right? He has to dodge the jab and jump inside. He actually jumps inside on Chad Dawson. It happens near the ropes. And Chad Dawson, who really is not just talented, but is highly skilled. Chad Dawson is able to break the clinch by literally putting his forearm under Bernard Hopkins' chin. Right? That's a Floyd Mayweather move. Right? That's a move guys who are skilled in literally wrestling while boxing do. Right? Dawson has the complete skill set to deal with Bernard Hopkins grappling. And Bernard's going to have to grapple because he's not going to be throwing jabs against the southpaw. He's literally trying to get inside to grapple to throw predominantly power punches. Right? I don't think with that game plan he's going to be able to match Chad Dawson's volume. I think Dawson is just going to do too much. He's just going to keep Hopkins at the end of a jab for too long and then be able to diffuse Hopkins's ambush attacks and Hopkins's efforts to wrestle with him when Hopkins does jump inside. Right? I believe the reason, and it's strategic, that Bernard Hopkins is not saying anything about this fight, why he is silent on this fight, is because Chad Dawson's reputation is that he lets his mind wander during fights, gets distracted, and allows opponents to come back somewhat against him. He was dominating Tomas Ademic. He actually got popped and dropped late in that fight. He got off the canvas and he won the fight, but it looked like his mind wandered late in that fight. Right? Against Jean Pascal in a fight I thought he would win. It looked like he gave away too many rounds at the beginning of the fight. He looked unenthused. And then, of course, when he stepped on the gas, that fight got stopped because he got a cut. Right? Well, all I can say is I believe Hopkins doesn't want to upset Chad Dawson because he wants a distracted, lethargic Dawson in the ring. In fact, he has to bank on that because if Dawson comes in energetic, he's going to set a pace and he's going to throw a volume that Hopkins just can't match. Right? Hopkins is not throwing jabs from the outside. So if Dawson literally just is able to maintain a distance between the two, it's going to be a bad stylistic match for Hopkins because it's going to be a young guy throwing jabs while Hopkins runs away trying to stay outside of the jab. Right? So what Hopkins really needs is for Dawson to take him lightly, to allow him to hop inside, wrestle with him, throw power shots from up close at greater than a 40% clip. And my point is, even if Hopkins is able to do that, I don't think he's going to be able to do that enough to convince the judges. I like Chad Dawson in this one, just like I like Chad Dawson in the first fight. I believe Chad Dawson is where skill meets talent. I believe he's underrated. I believe Chad Dawson is the best light heavyweight in the world. We'll find out when these two fight. Thanks for watching.